Take a moment to relax yourself. Breathe in and breathe out. Relax yourself. Be seated with a position, whatever the way you are comfortable. It could be on your bed, on the chair, on a cushion. Relax yourself. Close your eyes only if you are comfortable. Take a deep breath and let it go. Now we are going to practice the metta thoughts, loving kindness thoughts. May I be well and happy, peaceful and free from suffering. May no harm come to me. May no difficulties come to me. May no problems come to me. May I always find fulfillment. May I have patience, courage, understanding, and determination to meet and overcome the inevitable difficulties, problems, and failures in life. May my teachers, all Dharma teachers, parents, brothers and sisters, friends, well-wishers, relatives, and all those who are indifferent to me, all beings in the universe, be well and happy, peaceful and free from suffering. May no harm come to them. May no difficulties come to them. May no problems come to them. May they always find fulfillment. May they also have patience, courage, understanding, and determination to meet and overcome the inevitable difficulties, problems, and failures in life. Again and again, you can spread these loving kindness thoughts to the whole universe. You can practice these metta thoughts from yourself and to the beings in the universe. Practice these loving kindness thoughts in silence for a few more minutes. And you can stop these loving kindness thoughts just for now when you hear the bell. May all beings in the universe be well, happy, and peaceful.
Right now, time for the Dhamma Talk. Today, our speaker is Subodhi Stephen. Stephen, thank you for being with us today, and we really appreciate about your help.
I pay homage to the Buddha. I pay homage to the Dhamma. I pay homage to the Sangha. A couple weeks ago, my wife had wanted to go to a bookstore. You know, a rare treat these days with the lack of them. And so we went to Vroman's in Pasadena. It's one of our favorite bookstores. And as my wife was looking around, trying to pick out whatever it is that she wanted from the trip, I walked around as well and found myself in the Eastern philosophy section. And in the Eastern philosophy section, they have the Buddhist section, which usually has a lot of the same books. There usually isn't a whole lot of new books there, but I look anyway, you know, just to see if there's anything that catches my eye. And while I was there, I did see something. There was a book there that had a very garish and bright cover and a little kind of cartoon on the front and a very alliterative name. And I thought, oh, let me take a look at this one. And I perused through the book and grasped more or less what it's about. And the author is a 33-year-old Western man who, when he was 25, went to the Thai forest to stay at a monastery there for about 6 months. And he decided to write about his experience. And I thought, oh, how neat that there's a book like this that's still around, published by someone, you know, pretty young, actually. You know, it seems like those kind of books were more popular 20, 30 plus years ago, maybe even more years ago, where you'd find someone who would say to the audience, hey, spiritual seeker, you know that place that you've been fantasizing about, this really remote place where there's all this cool spiritual stuff happening? I went there and let me tell you about it. And so it was almost refreshing and nostalgic to see someone doing this yet again. Like, hey, have you ever thought about going to the forest to meditate? Well, I did it. Let me tell you about it. And so I decided to buy the book. I didn't have any high hopes for it. And, you know, by no means am I going to give you some at length book review on it. But I bought it thinking, oh, this might be fun to read. And then I didn't really read much of it. I read a little bit here and there. And I wasn't sure if I would actually have enough time to read the whole thing, because I'm actually quite a slow reader these days. I tend to read a couple pages and then stop reading for a bit to think about what I read a couple pages and then think for more time. And the same time I do that, my wife has completely devoured a book. So I'm a pretty slow reader. But then luckily, my wife and I got sick with a stomach flu. We had food poisoning. And so then I had a lot of time. And so I made sure to read the book. And it ended up being a lot of what I thought. It was, you know, a Western guy who didn't know a whole lot about meditation, who didn't know a whole lot about Buddhism, that went off to do some stuff for 6 months and went in with a lot of misconceptions and left with a lot of misconceptions. And that's more or less all I'll say about the book. But what I found troubling in the book was this particular man's views in regard to why he chose the forest tradition in the first place, and also the ways in which he viewed the Buddha, which I think are misconceptions worth straightening out, so to speak. One misconception was that the forest tradition exists to be essentially a kind of Buddhist boot camp, you know, that it's rigorous and hard and difficult and challenging and not for all the little wimps out there who can't hack it, you know. No, this is where the real stuff happens. And that's not really the case. And And the fact that it even wasn't the case there in Thailand, it was actually a bit of concern for the author. But then the other thing too that this author had was this obsession and romanticization of the Buddha's time before he became the Buddha, when he was still a monk, just trying to figure things out, like a lot of people try to figure things out, when he was doing his austerities. This is what this guy was really on about. And he ended up with this one story, and I don't know where he found this story. It could be that the story is in the commentaries and just managed to find its way around, or is something that he heard at some center somewhere else. But he's pretty convinced that the Buddha, towards the end of his austerities, was walking around one day and was so weak that he fell face first into like a cow pie, into like some manure or something, just face planted right into some feces on the street. And it's not something that I had ever read anywhere, and it's not something that I had been familiar with, but this person took this story as an example of just like, wow, how hardworking the Buddha was, how much he was striving and agonizing and suffering, and like that's what real spirituality looks like. That's what it means to be a seeker. And so this person, when he went off on his journey, tried to find ways of doing similar things, starving himself to the point where he was becoming thin, and monks were concerned for him, and he just was arrogantly like, oh, you guys don't get it, what I'm doing here, And that stuff is quite dangerous. And so I wanted to talk about that particular time in the Buddha's life, so that we recognize it not as something that should be romanticized, not something that we should look at and covet as if that's something that he was doing the right way. That when the Buddha shares that particular period of his life, he's sharing stuff that he did wrong. He's showing his mistakes as a teacher to his students, saying like, look, this is something I did that was not useful, and I ended up finding something much better, and that's what I'm going to share with you. And so in light of that, there is one sutta in particular where the Buddha does talk about his progression, his time before he became the Buddha, and it's in the Majjhima Nikaya. And this one is the Maha Sachaka Sutta. And this one is one of those cases where the Buddha takes some time to talk to someone that perhaps other teachers wouldn't have spoken to. So the reason why this sutta is called the Mahasachaka Sutta is because Sachaka was a Niganta. He was a Jain. And more than that, he was known as a particular kind of sophist. Like he was an argumentative guy. He liked to go around to spiritual teachers and really put them to the test, put them through the ringer. He wanted to find people and poke holes in their philosophies, their beliefs, their practices, and that's where he found his delight, his joy. And most people would usually just walk by this guy. They didn't want to get involved. And so this story happens at such a time when the Buddha is walking around with his attendant Ananda, and they both see that Sachaka is coming their way. And so he and Ananda talk about it, and then they both decide, all right, well, what we're going to do is we're actually going to wait for this guy. So they take a seat and wait for this guy to come up. And sure enough, he sees the Buddha and he goes, I'm going to go talk to him. And he comes before the Buddha and starts talking right away about, hey, there's this spiritual path. They do it this way, they do it that way. I see traditions in some cases where people are really good about developing the body, but they don't develop the mind, and they have all sorts of bad consequences from that. And then I see other traditions and they really develop the mind, but they don't develop the body, and they have all sorts of repercussions from that, coughing up blood and things like that. He brings up all these really powerful images that are perhaps hyperbole. They're maybe not things that actually happen, but he's in this negative sense of like, this is what happens when people have an imbalanced path. And then so the Buddha talks about how what he teaches is something that's balanced. It's something that develops both the body and the mind and leads to release. And that path that he has and the release that it leads to is such that even when negative feelings, even when painful feelings happen in body and mind, someone who's free of defilements, free of hindrances, ends up being unaffected. And this interlocutor, this guy, who wants to debate the Buddha, says, well, maybe that's the case, for you, because you've never really had to deal with those kind of negative feelings, bodily pain, mental afflictions. Maybe you've never had to deal with any of that stuff. And the Buddha is like, really? All right, well, let me tell you. And so that's when the Buddha starts talking about his path as a meditator, as a spiritual seeker. And he starts from the very beginning. He starts from when he was a young man and looking at the householder's life and seeing it as something really not worthwhile, something that he didn't want. And so years later, he makes the choice to actually leave. And he talks about how his family is crying as he's shaving off his hair and putting on the ochre robes, but then he goes off and does it. And the very first thing that the Buddha does is he actually goes out and tries to find teachers. He didn't strike out on his own, which is oftentimes the sort of romanticized story that we hear, is that he throws on the robes, shaves off his head and his hair, and then immediately goes off into austerities. He goes off into the forest to lose his mind and starve himself. And that's not actually the case. That wasn't the first thing that he tried. What he did first was to find reputable teachers that were very skilled, that had a large following of students who seemed to be wise and seemed to be released. He goes to one such teacher and becomes a student there. And he's a good student. So really quickly, he gets very good at chanting all the right chants, learning all the right words, doing all the right practices, and then goes to the teacher and wants to know more about what the teacher has in terms of meditation. And this first teacher that he goes to has actually a pretty advanced state of meditation that he can reach. It's one of the formless attainments known as the dimension of nothingness. And so this teacher tells the Buddha, like, yeah, you practice this way, and you're gonna realize all the things you need to realize. You're gonna be free in all the ways you can be free. So like, let's practice this and see what happens. And of course, because the Buddha, being the student he is, he excels at it. He excels at the dimension of nothingness, becomes a master of it, goes to his teacher again. And the teacher says, yeah, you've realized everything I've realized. There's nothing else to teach you. You can be a teacher alongside me. The Buddha looks inside himself and says, okay, well, I could stay here and be a teacher with this guy and teach the community that he has, but I don't feel like I'm free. I don't feel like I'm free of defilements. I don't feel like I've achieved what it is I'm seeking to achieve. So he goes to another teacher. And this teacher is perhaps even more advanced. This teacher has achieved even a higher state, the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. Wow, like that's, like when we talk about formless attainments, there could be many, many different attainments. We tend to talk about mostly 4 of them, these formless attainments being the dimension of the infinitude of space, the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness, the dimension of nothingness, and the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. So like, whoa, like these are states that people can achieve. And because they're so high, these attainments, people can mistake this for the real deal. They can mistake this for release. And so the same pattern follows. The Buddha puts into practice this style of meditation, manages to achieve the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. But then the same thing happens. He looks inside and he goes, nah, I don't really feel what this guy is saying. He's saying, I've done it. This is it. This is the best I can do. But this doesn't really feel like the best. And it's only after that he says, you know what, I think I'm going to strike out on my own. And then he does. And he goes off and travels around for a while. He ends up finding a grove in a really pretty area that's right outside a military town. And he looks at this place and sees how pretty it is. And he goes, you know what, this is a place worth settling down into practice. I'm going to practice here. And during that time, he has this insight that he feels is important. You know, in the sutta itself, he talks about how like these really weren't thoughts that someone told me and taught me. They came from my own mind, and they're similes about what's required to really develop on the path. He imagines what someone would need if they were trying to start a fire, what kind of wood they would need. And so he imagines that there's someone who's looking for firewood, and they find a piece of wood floating in the water that's all waterlogged and filled with sap. And he's like, well, how well would that work to start a fire? Well, not very well at all. Like, it's not going to produce any flames. And he imagines that that's basically the run-of-the-mill person. That's the kind of person that's living a normal life with no real concern for their spiritual development, and they're still caught up in sensuality, both bodily and mentally. And they're just living in the muck of it, just in the midst of it, not trying to remove or seclude themselves in any way. And then he imagines, okay, well, maybe there's another branch of wood, this time not sitting in the water. It's actually off to the edge. It's not near the water, but it's still damp and wet and filled with sap. Well, how might that one go about being a firewood? Is that going to be very useful? Well, it's still damp and filled with sap, so it's not really going to produce any strong flames. Because the way he imagines it, well, this is like the person who has removed themselves bodily from sensuality, but in their minds, inside, internally, just still swirling with sensuality, thoughts, desires, feelings, everything. They're just a storm inside, even though they've removed themselves. They've gone off somewhere to seclude themselves bodily. We can imagine that this is someone who even follows precepts and tries to do things in action, but inside, none of that stuff has actually taken root at all in terms of sensuality. And then he imagines a third piece of wood. This one, not only is it really far away from any water, it's perfectly dry inside. There's no dampness in the wood, there's no sap. This one's going to burn bright. If you try to start a fire with this one, it'll be a smokeless fire. The heat will be so strong. That's the contemplative. That's like the Brahmin who has removed himself bodily and mentally, withdrawn himself bodily and mentally from sensuality. That's the kind of person that can really, really see results from meditation. And so this was a true insight. He was correct to see this. But then his immediate thoughts after that end up leading him astray, because he takes those things to an extreme. That's when he starts his austerity practice. It's with that in mind. I'm going to remove sensuality bodily and mentally. So he sets to work. He decides he's going to sit down and meditate in such a way where he's pressing his tongue up to the roof of his mouth. He's just right there, just bearing down as hard as he can, and all with the desire to stamp down and suppress any thoughts of sensuality. And the thing is, in terms of any sensual thoughts, it actually works. He realizes that, like, wow, like my mind, no thoughts are coming up in terms of sensuality, but my body's a wreck. He's like, I'm pressing down in this way. I'm starting to sweat from my armpits. I'm starting to get a headache. My body's all racked with pain as I get up for meditation. Like, this is awful. And he goes, you know what? Maybe I can really just push through this and be even more severe. And that's when he gets to a whole different practice. He decides then, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start withholding my breath during my meditation. What that means is that I want to get to a breathless state. And what I'm going to do is, rather than see if I can get the air so light in my body, the breath so gentle and refined that perhaps any sensation of breath goes away. No, literally, I'm going to plug everything up and see what happens. So that means when he sits down to meditate, he doesn't breathe through his nose. He doesn't breathe through his mouth. He just kind of holds it all in as much as he can. And he talks about the sensations he feels, how his head starts pounding. He can feel all this pressure in his body. He feels faint. His flesh feels hot. He's miserable as he's doing this, realizing that, like, man, my body is just hurting. And he looks at his mind again and he goes, well, I mean, there are no thoughts of sensuality coming in. So like, I guess maybe this is doing something, but perhaps I'm not doing enough. And he goes even further into an extreme. And so it's at this part that I'll read it, because I want to capture just precisely in as far as we have the Buddha's words in terms of what he did. I thought, what if I were to take only a little food at a time, only a handful at a time of bean soup, lentil soup, veg soup, or pea soup? So I took only a little food at a time, only a handful at a time of these soups. My body became extremely emaciated. Simply from my eating so little, my limbs became like the jointed segments of vine stems or bamboo stems. My backside became like a camel's hoof. My spine stood out like a string of beads. My ribs jutted out like the jutting rafters of an old run-down barn. The gleam of my eyes appeared to be sunk deep in my eye sockets, like the gleam of water deep in a well. My scalp shriveled and withered like a green bitter gourd, shriveled and withered in the heat and wind. The skin of my belly became so stuck to my spine that when I thought of touching my belly, I grabbed hold of my spine as well. And when I thought of touching my spine, I grabbed hold of the skin of my belly as well. If I urinated or defecated, I fell over on my face right there. Simply from my eating so little, if I tried to ease my body by rubbing my limbs with my hands, the hair, rotted at its roots, fell from my body as I rubbed, simply from eating so little. So perhaps that book I was talking about, this guy got this impression of the Buddha falling over into some feces, because in here he does say that he was so emaciated and so weak that when he himself had the ability, even with the little food he was drinking and eating, to urinate or defecate, the effort of it was so extreme that he would collapse. He would fall over. And so that is a practice that he was doing because of that simile that he had come up with, because he had rightly recognized that if someone really wants to develop in meditation and achieve any goal of release or freedom, they have to have states free of sensuality during the meditation, but then as they approach the goal, to be truly free of sensuality, free of all kinds of craving and clinging. But sensuality as a hindrance to meditation is quite important to focus on. But he took it to that extreme, took it to that point of doing all these terrible things to his body. And so he starts thinking about all this that he had done to himself. He thought of how deep his pain was in his own body, how afflicted he was. He said that whatever contemplatives or Brahmins in the present are feeling painful, racking, piercing feelings due to their striving, this is the utmost. He thought, this is the most pain I could possibly give myself. And he says, none is greater than this. But with this racking practice of austerities, I haven't attained any superior human state, any distinction in knowledge or vision worthy of the noble ones. Could there be another path to awakening? So when we think about why the Buddha shares this part of his story, it's not something that we should look at as, oh, this is what I need to do as well. And the thing is, we hear this extreme case and we go, well, sure, I'm not going to starve myself, and oh, well, sure, I'm not going to sit there trying to plug up my nostrils and my mouth and tape my mouth over and everything. But that first part that he did before he got to the most extreme of his austerities is actually something that many of us do when we first approach meditation, which is that we think they're just sort of sitting here and forcing things down, we're going to have any success in that. The whole process of sitting there with your jaw tight and your tongue pressed up to the roof of your mouth, your shoulders up. I heard that description, and what it reminded me most of is new meditators. Because a lot of the time, when I've first started as a meditator, when I look at other new meditators, there's this idea that I'm going to sit here and just through my force of will, things are going to happen a certain way. That just pushing things down, things are going to stay down. And that's a kind of austerity that we might end up bringing to our practice. This belief that we have to, in any way, torture ourselves in the practice. That we think that that's what real renunciation is. That that's what we think real equanimity even is. That what we need to do is just kind of sit there and grit our teeth. Because, you know, we're in some kind of Buddhist boot camp, let's say, in the case of this one guy. So I do think that when the Buddha shares that story, what's important there is not looking at him and seeking to emulate him in that austerity. It's what he realized after the fact. I thought, I recall once when my father the Sakyan, was working, and I was sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree, then quite secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful qualities, I entered and remained in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. Could that be the path to awakening? Then there was the consciousness following on that memory. That is the path to awakening, I thought. So why am I afraid of that pleasure that has nothing to do with sensuality, nothing to do with unskillful qualities? I thought, I am no longer afraid of that pleasure that has nothing to do with sensuality, nothing to do with unskillful qualities. But that pleasure is not easy to achieve with a body so extremely emaciated. And so he seeks then to strengthen his body. So in that sutta, the Buddha, in sharing his own story, is also highlighting precisely in what way one is developing both body and mind. It's not that we neglect the body in favor of the mind. And it's not that we neglect the mind in favor of the body. But rather that we see both as part of a team that needs to function well. Oftentimes, in terms of meditation, we talk about samatha and vipassana as being like two oxen tied together, pulling a cart. But in terms of cultivation as well, we can also look at the body and mind doing precisely that same thing, yoked together in a particular practice. And something like breath meditation, the breath is the yoke that brings body and mind together. And we can't, not only can we not neglect one over the other, but any kind of austerity that negatively affects one or the other couldn't possibly be good practice. In terms of what we think the path is, I think what's really important to keep in mind is what the Buddha says here about pleasure. Because I have to admit that for the longest time in my own practice, I thought that any kind of pleasure or happiness was something that needed to be completely tossed aside, couldn't be considered important in any way. If it came up, it was something that was just another thing that came up. It's just ephemeral and you cast it aside. When the Buddha is talking about his middle way, though, it's precisely this issue of someone being that worldly person caught up not doing anything, and the person who is completely caught up in austerities. This middle way is actually around the whole process of rapture and pleasure in the first place. That what we see in the path is not a path of denial and a path of repression, not something strict or harsh or limiting. That everything we do in terms of our bodily action, our thoughts, our words, all three modes of action that we do, everything that we do on the path is to allow to find pleasure that is non-sensual, to find pleasure that is harmless to ourselves. The kind of things that don't trap us and keep us stuck in samsara, but the kind of happiness that makes the path possible. And so I can see how throughout the year so far, I've had that as a theme that has been a part of many of my talks. And I bring it up with a good reason, because this is a true problem that I think that many Westerners face in terms of Buddhism. And I for a while thought perhaps it was a problem of the past. But if a young 30-something as well can have these same notions of what the path looks like in terms of how strenuous it is and how kind of macho it is to follow these austerities, then perhaps it is worth stating again that what the Buddha taught was a path to happiness that also in it contains happiness as an important part that needs to be highlighted, reminded, reinforced continually, lest we forget what it is that we're trying to do. That this kind of effort that we use in the path is not a middling effort. It doesn't mean that we are permissive in terms of what we do, but it's also not so deeply repressive and forceful that we end up essentially cutting ourselves off and suffering endlessly and without really any real, I suppose, without any real real reason to do it. This misconception that this person had in the book I was referencing before ended up coloring his whole experience. And what it meant is that when he saw monks practicing and actually enjoying their lives as a monk, he was actually critical of what he saw. What that meant is that when he was staying at one of the monasteries and he thought he was going to be Mr. Badass Meditator, and he was actually invited to a sauna that the monks were going to, it was actually on the monastery grounds, he was aghast, disgusted, like, what, they're going to go to the sauna? And so he goes to the sauna. The monks have a little room there that they heat up, the nice steam to help cleanse the pores and keep the body healthy. And he goes inside and he's sitting with the monks and he's just like, can't believe they're doing this. And at one point, there's a young monk who sees one of the senior monks and offers to give the senior monk a back rub. And so this guy who's just staying for a short amount of time looks at this behavior and he's just like, goodness, look how sensual this all is. We're in the sauna and there's this monk just rubbing the back of another monk, right? And he ends up, his perceptions color the whole experience. So rather than just having this nice, enjoyable evening that everyone else is having, you know, they're following everything else. They're having one meal a day. They're, you know, following all the precepts. They meditate, and they're just having a nice evening, you know, just enjoying the sauna. And then they're going to go back to their kutis. They're going to go back to their practice, and the whole experience is going to be over. For this guy, it ends up becoming this whole scandalous affair that he can't believe is happening. And then, quite ironically, later on, he ends up getting into an accident that ends up injuring his neck. And so that same young monk offers to give him a back rub. And he's like, oh yeah, this feels okay. I'm like, well, yeah, that's the point. That there are things that we do in life that do feel okay. And those things that we do, so long as they are harmless, so long as they avoid all the traps and snares that the precepts exist to save us from, then they are harmless things that we do. And it's okay to then enjoy those things without getting caught up. We don't want to be like the damp wood where the wood itself is removed from all the sensuality, but the sensuality is still swirling inside. So in many ways, what we seek to do is living a kind of lifestyle. And it's that lifestyle that ended up really confusing this guy that I've been talking about, because he seemed quite shocked that when he spoke to this monk who had been practicing this particular tradition for, at that point, several decades, he asks him like, well, like, how is it to live this life? And this guy says, oh, it's like a dream. And this guy writing this book couldn't believe it. Like a dream, like it just seems so cliche. And he thinks about it more and goes, oh, well, maybe. But the thing is that when the Buddha talks about the practice that he started at that point, after he put austerities aside, and he talks about the monks and lay people that were practicing with him over the course of his life, for the rest of his life as a teacher, he talks about how happy everyone is. And why is that something that we neglect in the West? Why is it that when there, and it's not all Westerners, but there is this tendency in some of us to want to go to extremes. We think that everything is all or nothing. And what that ends up meaning is that in our practice too, the things that we enjoy either have to be all or nothing. That means that when we sit down to meditate, it has to be either all or nothing. And this can have so many examples, even in terms of thoughts. We've been taught in the West so long that meditation means the mind is completely blank and empty. And that's what makes us sit there like that with our tongues plastered to the roof of our mouths, squinting so hard that we start to sweat and perspire, because we believe that meditation means no thoughts, rather than recognizing that meditation means that we choose our thoughts carefully in terms of which ones we listen to and which ones we don't. And as we do that, our thoughts become more rarefied. They fall further into the background until the thoughts, in any kind of coarse way, disappear entirely. And what we're left with is equanimity and mindfulness. So this is another reminder, I suppose, of the benefits of the gradual path that the Buddha discovered and that the Buddha set out as the path that leads to release. I think it's useful to keep that in mind as we seek to emulate him. What we're not emulating is his austerity. What we're emulating is what he did after. That's what led to his release.
Thank you, Subodh. Does anybody have any question, any comment?
I do.
Yes.
Hey, Stephen. Thank you for that talk. So any advice on how to, I mean, it's the last part of what you said, but like when meditating, and I've been doing this for years, but I keep getting carried away by my thoughts. And what's interesting is another teacher I have told me, because I wasn't getting enough sleep, I was getting by on like 5 hours of sleep a night. He's like, try adding more sleep to your day, and maybe that'll help. And it did. I do have more focus. I've been sleeping closer to 7 hours a night for the past like month almost, and I've been definitely having more. I feel more concentrated when I sit, but I still keep thinking about the present and the future. My mind's just constantly. I keep getting swept up in the thoughts, right? And it's like, how do I keep the focus on the breath and let the thoughts go to the background, like you were talking about?
So this is why the Buddha emphasized ingenuity in terms of practice. You know, what that means is that we have to get creative in terms of problem solving. So even in the case of the one teacher who told you that perhaps more sleep might help, that's because in some cases that does help. I'm sure it is helping, even to the extent that you said it is. I know that for myself, one thing that ended up being very important early on in my meditation to help quiet down those thoughts was actually giving time for just thinking, because I realized that my day was so busy with activities school and work and socializing and family interactions. And then when I did have downtime, I might be watching movies or reading books. And then only in between all of that, sort of bookmarking that, would I then find time to sit down and meditate. And sure enough, because I'd spent the whole day so busy, I hadn't had a thought to myself, that's when all the thoughts would rush in. And so what I allowed myself was for some part of the day to not really to be about any activity, even the activity of meditation, but to just sit around and just let myself process my thoughts. And to do that for a while and sort of think myself done until the thoughts were pretty much it. Like, okay, I've given myself time to process for about 20 minutes or so, not really doing much thinking now. Maybe now I'll sit down to meditate and to actually do formal meditation where I'm bringing my attention repeatedly back to the breath. And I did find that in cases like that, it did help. It actually made it easier, because then my mind wasn't so excited, like, oh, finally, I have a moment where I can just think, because I'd already given myself that moment to think, which meant that once I was done with that, I could then give it some other kind of direction. But then also, within the meditation itself, there are things that we can do in terms of the practice, in terms of the breath. Rather than keeping the breath as something passive that's just sort of happening in the background, we can bring our awareness of the breath to the forefront, and any thoughts that are not related to the breath, we can just let them be there, and without drawing us away. And if they do draw us away, then we just bring ourselves back. And that part is just part of the practice. It's part of the repetition. But doing that in a forgiving way. We don't want to be harsh with ourselves in those moments. But if we can make sure that whatever it is we're doing with the breath, we do it in such a way that the breath remains interesting, remains vital, something in our present awareness, then the attention with the breath might become strong enough to say push some of those other thoughts out of the way, or at least into the background. Experiment. So see what you can do with your thoughts outside of meditation, and see how that affects your meditation. And then also see what you can do with the breath during your meditation to keep it more interesting. And that might help quiet down the thoughts over time.
Thank you. The thoughts are often ones that I've had before that are recurring, like work stuff. So I'm giving them more time. I feel like they're circular thoughts, like they keep popping up even when I do devote time to them, but I'll definitely try on the breath.
Yeah, that could be it. I mean, especially with habitual thoughts and thoughts that are related to what you're doing throughout the day, like if they're work-related thoughts, those ones are harder to push to the side in that way, because like that's where your mind wants to go. That's where your mind is used to going. It's habitual. You've made real deep ruts in the road. And so what's needed then is really doing something with the breath and your awareness of the body that brings your consciousness from the head down into the body. Sometimes meditating directly on your feet or hands, right at the fingertips and toe tips, and trying to keep your attention there and away from your head could help too. But like I said, that's having that quality of ingenuity, with being willing to experiment with your meditation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Subodha. Thank you for everybody. I think looks like we don't have any question, and we have to chant also. We're going to chant page 4 and page 10. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa
Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Buddham Saranam Gacchami Dhammam Saranam Gacchami Sangham Saranam Gacchami. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them all. Deluded passions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them all. Dharma gates are limitless. I vow to study them all. Buddha's way is supreme. I vow to attain it. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and the sick find health freely. Bengitu kongadu boska dunya na Thy Father, my Father, Thy Father. Om Mani Padme.
Thank you for everybody. Few announcement next week. Reverend Panyaloka is going to give a Dhamma talk, and there are important message today. It is somebody's birthday today. We have a one birthday boy sitting in front of me, and we have wished for the happy birthday. I think we have a birthday cake also. So somebody bring the birthday cake, then we can wish the happy birthday for the Kashanti. Sansara. Cake එකක් තියෙනවනේ දෙපැත්ත. You want to bring the cake here right now?
Yes, after we finish.
Okay. We'll finish everything, and thank you again, and we wish you the happy birthday and good health for you. Especially health is the important thing. We bless you a little later, say, oh, we can do Panyaloka right now, eh? Little bit busy. Oh, okay. Put again the Muqaddas. Yes.
I'm ready.